The phrase, "I lost feelings," is almost never the beginning of the story. When someone says they've lost feelings, what they're really doing is naming the end of a process that's already been unfolding for weeks, maybe months. By the time those words are spoken, the emotional behavior has already shifted. The attachment patterns have already loosened. The psychological dynamics of the relationship have already reorganized themselves around distance rather than closeness. What sounds like a sudden confession is actually the final articulation of something that's been happening quietly, beneath the surface, long before it was ever put into language. And understanding that gap, between when feelings begin to fade and when someone finally admits it, is where relationship psychology becomes essential. Most people focus on the moment of the confession. They replay the conversation. They search for what they did wrong in the days leading up to it. But the real story doesn't live in that moment. It lives in the pattern of behavior that came before it, in the tone that flattened, in the timing that stretched, in the presence that thinned. These are the early indicators of emotional distance, and they appear long before anyone has the clarity or the courage to name what's happening. The mistake most people make is treating feelings as something that disappears suddenly, when in reality, emotional withdrawal is a gradual process, one that leaves evidence at every stage if you know how to read it. This isn't about blame. It's not about pointing fingers or assigning fault. It's about recognizing that human behavior operates according to patterns, and those patterns reveal emotional states more honestly than words ever will. When someone begins to pull back, when their engagement becomes effortful rather than instinctive, when their emotional investment starts to decline, they're communicating something, even if they haven't said it yet. The relationship dynamics shift before the relationship ends. The feelings fade before anyone admits they're fading. And the gap between what's happening internally and what's being expressed externally is where the real story lives. What follows isn't a guide to winning someone back. It's an investigation into what "I lost feelings" actually means, how it develops, and what it hides beneath the surface. There's a particular rhythm people fall into when something inside a relationship begins to shift. It doesn't announce itself clearly. It doesn't arrive with confrontation or explanation. What happens instead is quieter. A slow mismatch between what is said and what is done. Words still carry warmth. Reassurances still come when asked. But somewhere underneath, the behavior starts pulling in a different direction. The emotional behavior no longer aligns with the language being used, and that gap, however small at first, becomes the first real evidence that something has changed. This disconnect doesn't feel dramatic in the moment. It feels like nothing, or almost nothing. A reply that comes later than it used to. A conversation that ends sooner. An evening spent together where the attention drifts somewhere else, not obviously, but enough to be felt. These moments don't trigger alarms because they can still be explained. Life gets busy. People get tired. Stress builds. But when these explanations start repeating, when the pattern becomes consistent rather than occasional, the gap between what's being said and what's being shown begins to widen. And it's in that widening space that emotional distance starts to take shape. What makes this stage so difficult to name is that nothing has been openly withdrawn yet. There's no argument, no coldness, no refusal. On the surface, everything still functions. But beneath that surface, the psychological dynamics have already started shifting. The relationship is still moving, but it's no longer moving toward closeness. It's moving toward maintenance, toward autopilot. The energy that used to flow naturally now requires intention, And when intention starts replacing instinct, the foundation has already begun to crack. Attachment patterns don't collapse all at once. They erode, slowly, through a series of barely visible reductions. And here's what most people miss during this phase. They're still trying to read the relationship through isolated moments instead of through behavior analysis over time. One canceled plan feels like bad timing. 2 feel like coincidence. 3 start to feel like something else. But by then, the emotional withdrawal has already been building for weeks, maybe longer. The real shift didn't happen in any single moment. It happened in the accumulation of small retreats, each one subtle enough to dismiss alone, but together forming a clear trajectory. What started as a gap between words and actions has become a quiet recalibration of emotional investment. And once that recalibration begins, it rarely reverses on its own. Before someone says they've lost feelings, before they even consciously recognize it themselves, something shifts beneath the surface. It's not a decision. It's not a thought they've sat with and processed. It's an emotional recalibration that happens in the body first, in the instincts, in the way they begin to orient themselves within the relationship. The mind catches up later, but the emotional behavior changes before any narrative is built around it. This is why so many people are caught off guard, not because there were no signs, but because the signs appeared before the person pulling away had language for what was happening. This shift often feels like a subtle loss of pull. Where there used to be an automatic desire to reach out, to check in, to make plans, there's now a faint hesitation. Not refusal, just a beat of delay. A moment where the impulse doesn't come as quickly, where the thought of initiating contact feels slightly heavier than it used to. These micro shifts in emotional momentum are easy to ignore because they don't disrupt the relationship visibly. Everything still happens. Texts are still sent. Time is still spent together. But the internal drive behind those actions has quietly diminished. And that diminishment is the earliest form of emotional distance. What complicates this stage is that the person experiencing the shift often doesn't recognize it as meaningful yet. They might attribute it to stress, fatigue, or distraction. They might tell themselves it's temporary. And because they haven't named it, they continue behaving in ways that appear normal. They still show up. They still respond. But the feeling underneath has changed, and feelings don't lie the way words do. Attachment patterns begin to loosen before anyone acknowledges the loosening. The emotional system has already started to protect itself, to pull back slightly, to create space. And once that space opens, it rarely closes without conscious effort. This is the stage where relationship psychology becomes critical to understand. People assume emotional shifts happen because of specific events, a fight, a betrayal, a disappointment. But often the shift happens in the absence of conflict. It happens when emotional needs go unmet for long enough that the system stops expecting them to be met. It happens when the psychological dynamics of the relationship stop feeling reciprocal, even if no one has said anything out loud. The feelings don't disappear suddenly. They fade gradually, in a process so quiet that by the time it's noticed, it's already been underway for some time. And what follows that fading is not just emotional withdrawal. It's a change in how presence itself is delivered. Once the internal shift begins, it starts to show up in the smallest, most repeatable ways. Not in what's said, but in how it's said. Not in whether someone shows up, but in how they show up. The tone softens in a way that feels polite rather than warm. The timing of responses stretches just slightly longer. The enthusiasm that used to carry conversations begins to flatten, replaced by something more neutral, more measured. These aren't isolated incidents. They're patterns. And patterns, when consistent, become the most reliable form of communication a relationship has. Tone is one of the first things to shift because it's instinctive. It's not something people control consciously in the early stages of emotional distance. When someone is emotionally invested, their tone carries energy. There's lightness, curiosity, playfulness. But when that investment begins to pull back, the tone becomes functional. It answers questions. It maintains the interaction. But it doesn't add anything extra. It doesn't reach. This shift is so subtle that it's often missed entirely by the person delivering it, but it's felt immediately by the person receiving it. The warmth hasn't disappeared. It's just not being offered as freely. Timing follows the same trajectory. Replies that used to come quickly now take longer. Not hours, maybe. Just enough to be noticeable. Just enough to create a micro-pause in the rhythm of connection. Plans that used to be easy to make now require more coordination, more thought, more negotiation. Spontaneity fades. What once felt effortless now feels slightly effortful. And effort, when it becomes visible, signals that something has changed in the emotional economy of the relationship. When someone has to think before engaging, it means engagement is no longer instinctive. And when it's no longer instinctive, it's already a form of behavior analysis in action. Only most people don't realize they're the subject being studied. Then there's enthusiasm. It's one of the most honest indicators of emotional investment, and it's nearly impossible to fake over time. Enthusiasm shows up in how someone talks about shared plans, how they respond to ideas, how they engage with the other person's world. When it's present, it's unmistakable. When it starts to withdraw, the absence is just as clear. Conversations still happen, but they lack momentum. Interest is expressed, but it's passive. Engagement occurs, but it's surface level. These small reductions compound, and what they reveal is not a loss of care overnight, but a gradual erosion of emotional participation. And once that erosion becomes a pattern, it's no longer about any single moment. It's about a shift in how the relationship is being experienced internally, long before it's explained externally. There's a feeling that starts to settle in before anything is openly wrong. It's not panic. It's not fear. It's something quieter. A low-level sense that things are off balance. Not broken, not collapsing, just uneven. One person begins to feel like they're leaning forward more often, checking in more, initiating more, caring more visibly. And on the other side, there's someone who's still there, still responding, still participating, but no longer matching that energy. The imbalance doesn't scream. It hums. And that hum is often the first signal that emotional distance has moved from internal to relational. This imbalance is felt before it's understood because the body registers shifts in reciprocity faster than the mind does. Something feels harder. Conversations require more effort to sustain. Silence feels heavier. Plans feel like they need more convincing. None of this is openly rejected, but none of it flows the way it used to either. And when flow is disrupted, the psychological dynamics of the relationship start to shift. What was once mutual begins to feel one-sided. What was once natural begins to feel maintained. And maintenance, when it becomes the dominant mode of relating, is a form of emotional labor that quietly exhausts the person carrying it. The tricky part is that this imbalance often doesn't come with explanation. The person pulling back may not even realize they're doing it. They're not withholding on purpose. They're not strategizing distance. They're simply responding to an internal shift that hasn't been named yet. But the person on the other side feels it immediately. They feel the extra weight. They feel the gap between what they're offering and what's being returned. And because there's no open conflict, because nothing has been said, they begin to question whether they're imagining it, whether they're being too sensitive, whether they're overanalyzing. But the feeling persists because the imbalance is real. This is where attachment patterns begin to activate in different ways. The person feeling the imbalance often moves toward closeness, trying to reestablish connection, trying to restore balance through increased effort. But increased effort in response to emotional withdrawal rarely brings someone back. It often accelerates the distancing. Because when one person leans in harder and the other is already leaning out, the relational tension grows. What was a quiet imbalance becomes an unstable push-pull. And in that instability, both people start responding to the dynamic rather than to each other. The feelings aren't just fading, they're being rearranged by the very attempts to preserve them. And what comes next is the slow realization that something is happening, even if no one has said it yet. In the beginning, the reduction in presence is so slight it almost doesn't register. Someone is a little quieter than usual, a little less available, a little slower to engage. It's easy to explain away. They're tired. They're stressed. They've got a lot going on. And because life does get complicated, because people do have off weeks, these explanations feel reasonable. They feel generous, even. But when those explanations start to extend, when one off week becomes 2, then 3, then a pattern, the reduction in presence stops being situational and starts being structural. Something has shifted in how the person is showing up, and that shift is no longer temporary. Presence isn't just about physical availability, it's about emotional attentiveness. It's about whether someone is mentally and emotionally engaged when they're with you, or whether they're somewhere else even when they're sitting right there. Early in this stage, the disengagement is partial. They're still present enough to function within the relationship. They still listen. They still respond. But there's a zhi-liang to their attention that's changed. It's thinner, less invested, more distracted. And that thinness, even when subtle, is felt. The other person might not be able to name it yet, but they can sense that something is missing. That the person in front of them is no longer fully there. This is where emotional behavior becomes the most honest language in the relationship. Words can reassure. Words can promise. Words can maintain the appearance of connection. But behavior reveals where someone's emotional energy is actually going. And when presence starts to reduce, when attention becomes selective, when engagement requires more prompting, the behavior is speaking clearly, even if the words haven't caught up. The relationship psychology at play here is simple. People invest their presence where they feel emotionally compelled to be. When that compulsion fades, presence becomes optional. And optional presence, no matter how gently it's delivered, is a form of emotional withdrawal. What makes this stage so disorienting is that it's not yet definitive. There's still enough engagement to create hope, still enough responsiveness to delay concern. The person pulling back hasn't left. They haven't ended anything. They're just less there. And less there is harder to address than absence because it exists in a gray space where nothing is clearly wrong, but nothing feels clearly right either. The other person is left trying to interpret the reduction, wondering if it's real, if it's permanent, if it means something. And while they're interpreting, the emotional distance continues to grow, quietly, in the space between what's still being offered and what's slowly being taken away. There's a point in every relationship where effort becomes visible, where what used to happen naturally now requires thought, energy, intention. At first, this shift is absorbed quietly. One person begins carrying more of the emotional load, reaching out more, planning more, checking in more, caring more loudly. And because relationships go through seasons, because people do have moments where they need to be carried, this imbalance feels temporary. It feels like something that will correct itself once things settle. But when the season doesn't end, when the imbalance becomes the norm, the relationship dynamics start to reorganize around that inequality. And that reorganization changes everything. Emotional effort is one of the clearest indicators of investment. When someone is emotionally engaged, effort doesn't feel like effort. It feels like expression. But when emotional engagement starts to fade, effort becomes labor. It becomes something that has to be summoned rather than something that flows. And when one person is flowing while the other is summoning, the difference is unmistakable. The person still investing feels it in their body. The weight of holding the relationship up alone, the exhaustion of being the only one reaching, the quiet ache of giving more than they're receiving. And the person withdrawing may not feel it at all, because they've already begun to disengage from the reciprocity the relationship was built on. What's particularly painful about this stage is that it often unfolds without conflict. There's no fight about the imbalance, no confrontation about who's doing more. The person carrying the relationship might not even bring it up, because part of them is hoping that if they just keep giving, the other person will eventually meet them halfway again. But that's not how emotional withdrawal works. When someone has internally begun to pull back, increased effort from the other side doesn't draw them closer. It often deepens their retreat, because the effort starts to feel like pressure, like expectation, like something they can't match and don't want to try to match. And so the distance grows, not despite the effort, but sometimes because of it. This is where behavior analysis becomes essential. The question isn't just, are they still showing up? It's, how are they showing up, and is that showing up reciprocal? When one person is initiating most of the contact, planning most of the time together, driving most of the emotional momentum, that's not a relationship in balance. That's a relationship where one person is doing the work of two. And over time, that kind of imbalance doesn't build connection. It builds resentment on one side and guilt or discomfort on the other. The feelings aren't just fading. They're being quietly crushed under the weight of an effort that's no longer shared. And what comes next is the moment where excuses stop working, and the distance can no longer be ignored. When presence starts to thin and effort becomes one-sided, the mind does something instinctive. It looks for explanations that preserve the relationship. It reinterprets the distance. It softens the edges of the withdrawal. It tells itself that this is temporary, that it's situational, that it's not what it looks like. Maybe they're just overwhelmed at work. Maybe they're dealing with something personal. Maybe they need space, and space is healthy. And if I just give them time, things will return to normal. These aren't delusions. They're survival mechanisms. Because accepting that someone is pulling away requires confronting a reality that most people aren't ready to face yet. Reinterpretation is a form of self-protection. It allows someone to stay in the relationship without fully acknowledging the emotional behavior that's unfolding in front of them. It creates a buffer between what's happening and what it might mean, And in that buffer, hope lives. The problem is that reinterpretation also delays clarity. It extends the period where patterns are dismissed as anomalies, where repetition is explained away as coincidence, where emotional distance is framed as anything other than what it actually is, a shift in how the other person is experiencing the relationship. And the longer that shift goes unnamed, the more entrenched it becomes. This stage is where mixed signals do the most damage, because the person pulling away often isn't doing it with full awareness or consistency. They still have moments of warmth. They still show up sometimes. They still say the right things when pressed. And those moments become the evidence used to justify staying, to justify waiting, to justify believing that the distance isn't real or permanent. But psychological dynamics don't work in isolated moments. They work in patterns. And when the pattern is withdrawal with occasional closeness, what that reveals is not someone who's temporarily distant. It's someone who's emotionally ambivalent. Someone who hasn't fully left, but hasn't fully stayed either. The danger here is that reinterpretation keeps someone locked in a loop. They keep giving the other person the benefit of the doubt. They keep adjusting their expectations. They keep finding reasons to explain why things feel off without naming the deeper truth underneath. And while they're reinterpreting, the other person continues to pull back at their own pace, often without realizing the full impact of their behavior. The relationship doesn't collapse. It just slowly becomes something different, something quieter, something more distant. And by the time the reinterpretation stops working, by the time the explanations run out, the emotional withdrawal is no longer early stage. It's already become the structure of the relationship itself. Avoidance doesn't always look like disappearing. Sometimes it looks like being present but unavailable. It looks like conversations that never go deeper than surface. It looks like plans that get vaguely agreed to, but never solidified. It looks like someone who's still technically there, but who's no longer leaning into the relationship with any real weight. This kind of avoidance is subtle because it doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic exit, no clear refusal, just a quiet, consistent pattern of emotional sidestepping that becomes more visible the longer it continues. The psychology of avoidance is rooted in discomfort. When someone begins to feel emotionally misaligned with a relationship, when the attachment patterns that once felt natural start to feel forced, the instinct is often to create space without creating conflict. They don't want to hurt the other person. They don't want to be the one who ends things. They may not even be sure yet what they want. So instead of addressing the shift directly, they avoid the deeper conversations. They avoid the vulnerability. They avoid the intimacy that would require them to either recommit or be honest about their retreat. And in that avoidance, the relationship begins to hollow out from the inside. These patterns show up in everyday interactions. Texts that stay surface level. Conversations that end before they get real. Physical presence without emotional presence. Sex that happens but feels disconnected. Time spent together that lacks the substance it used to have. None of these things are inherently damaging in isolation, but when they become the norm, when avoidance becomes the dominant mode of relating, the relationship psychology shifts entirely. What was once a partnership built on openness and emotional exchange becomes a space where both people are performing connection without actually connecting. And the person on the receiving end of that performance often feels it before they can name it. A persistent sense that something important is being withheld. Avoidance is also self-reinforcing. The more someone avoids depth, the more uncomfortable depth becomes. The longer they stay on the surface, the harder it is to go beneath it. And the relationship starts to operate in a kind of emotional stasis. Nothing gets better. but nothing gets addressed either. The person avoiding convinces themselves they're protecting the relationship by not rocking the boat. But what they're actually doing is allowing emotional distance to settle in as the new baseline. And once distance becomes familiar, once it becomes the norm, reversing it requires a level of vulnerability and effort that the person avoiding is no longer willing to give. What started as discomfort with depth becomes a permanent retreat from it. And that retreat, though quiet, is one of the clearest forms of emotional withdrawal a relationship can experience. Mixed signals are not confusion. They're clarity delivered inconsistently. When someone pulls back emotionally but still shows moments of warmth, still reaches out occasionally, still says things that sound reassuring, they're not trying to deceive. They're responding to their own internal ambivalence. They haven't fully decided to leave, but they also haven't recommitted to staying. And that in-between state creates a relational pattern where the other person is constantly trying to read which version of them is real. The one who seems distant, or the one who still seems to care. This inconsistency is destabilizing because human beings are wired to look for patterns. We need predictability to feel secure. And when behavior oscillates, close one day, distant the next, engaged in one moment, withdrawn an hour later, the mind struggles to form a coherent understanding of what's happening. The person receiving these mixed signals often blames themselves. They think they're overreacting when things feel off, then think they're imagining things when warmth returns. But the reality is simpler. The person sending the signals is genuinely conflicted. Their emotional behavior is reflecting an internal struggle they haven't yet resolved. And until they resolve it, the signals will continue to contradict each other. What makes this stage particularly painful is that mixed signals delay emotional clarity for both people. The person pulling away doesn't have to make a definitive choice, because they're still showing up just enough to keep things ambiguous. And the person trying to hold on doesn't have to confront the full reality of the withdrawal, because there are still moments that feel like connection. So both people stay suspended in uncertainty. Both people avoid the harder conversation. And in that avoidance, the relationship dynamics become increasingly unstable. What was once solid ground becomes something shifting, something unreliable, something that requires constant emotional vigilance just to navigate. Eventually, mixed signals stop being interpreted as confusion and start being recognized for what they actually are, a form of communication. They're the behavior of someone who's emotionally checked out enough to pull back, but not emotionally resolved enough to be honest about it. And that kind of in-between state isn't sustainable. It doesn't lead back to closeness. It leads to prolonged ambiguity, prolonged hope, and prolonged pain for the person still emotionally invested. Because when someone shows you distance most of the time and warmth only some of the time, the pattern is clear. They're not staying. They're not leaving. They're lingering. And lingering, in relational terms, is just a slower form of goodbye. What follows is not a return to connection. It's the final stage of emotional self-preservation, where both people begin to protect themselves in ways that make reconciliation nearly impossible. At a certain point, withdrawal stops being passive and becomes protective. It's no longer just about feeling less. It's about choosing to engage less in order to avoid feeling too much. This is where emotional self-protection replaces spontaneous engagement, where someone stops reaching out not because they forgot, but because reaching out requires a vulnerability they're no longer willing to offer, where presence becomes measured, calculated, controlled. The shift is complete. What was once instinctive connection is now managed distance. And once that protection is in place, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. Self-protection in relationships often looks like indifference, but it's not. It's a defense mechanism. It's what happens when someone has already begun the internal process of detaching, even if they haven't said it out loud yet. They stop initiating because initiating feels risky. They stop being vulnerable because vulnerability feels unsafe. They stop investing emotionally because investment has started to feel like loss. And in that protective state, the relationship becomes something they participate in from a distance, present enough to avoid confrontation, but removed enough to avoid being hurt. This is the final form of emotional withdrawal, and it's the hardest to reverse because it's no longer about feelings fading. It's about feelings being actively managed. What's critical to understand here is that self-protection doesn't happen in isolation. It's almost always a response to an accumulation of unmet emotional needs, unresolved tensions, or a growing sense that the relationship no longer feels reciprocal or safe. The person protecting themselves may not articulate this. They may not even fully recognize it. But their behavior reflects it. They've stopped taking emotional risks. They've stopped hoping for things to improve. They've stopped believing that closeness is worth the potential pain. And once that belief is gone, the psychological dynamics of the relationship are no longer oriented toward repair. They're oriented toward survival. This is the stage where attachment patterns become most visible. Someone with anxious attachment may cling harder, trying to pull the other person back through intensity or pursuit. Someone with avoidant attachment may retreat further, reinforcing the distance as a way to regain control. But regardless of the attachment style, the underlying truth is the same. When self-protection becomes the dominant emotional strategy, the relationship is no longer functioning as a partnership. It's functioning as a space where two people are trying not to get hurt. And in that space, connection doesn't grow, it withers. The feelings people thought they lost didn't disappear overnight. They were slowly withdrawn, piece by piece, as protection replaced presence, as safety replaced spontaneity, as self-preservation became more important than staying open. And once that shift is complete, what remains is not a relationship in crisis. It's a relationship that's already ended emotionally, even if no one has said the words yet. What "I lost feelings" actually hides is a timeline. A sequence of internal shifts that happened while the relationship was still functioning on the surface. It hides weeks of emotional recalibration, moments of quiet withdrawal, patterns of reduced presence that were never named. By the time someone says they've lost feelings, they're not describing something that just happened. They're describing the conclusion of a process that's been building in silence. And the person hearing it is often left trying to make sense of an ending they never saw coming. Not because there were no signs, but because the signs were written in behavior, not in words. Understanding this process doesn't undo what's already happened. It doesn't bring someone back or reverse emotional distance once it's fully set in. But it does provide clarity. It removes the illusion that feelings disappear randomly or without cause. It shows that emotional withdrawal follows a pattern, one that's rooted in unmet needs, imbalanced effort, avoidance, and self-protection. And when you can see that pattern clearly, you stop blaming yourself for missing something you were never directly told. You start recognizing that the relationship psychology at play was already in motion long before you had language for it. The truth is, most people who say they've lost feelings are operating from a place of emotional self-protection by the time they say it. They've already begun detaching. They've already started managing their exposure to pain. And while that might feel like rejection to the person on the receiving end, It's often just the final stage of a relational collapse that both people contributed to. One through withdrawal, the other through hoping the withdrawal wasn't real. Neither person is the villain. Both were responding to relationship dynamics that had already shifted beneath them. If you want to understand what happens after someone says they've lost feelings, why they feel relief at first, why that relief doesn't last, and what actually collapses once the initial distance settles in, you need to watch the previous video. Why the dumper feels relief before everything collapses. Because this is only half of the story. The other half is what happens inside the person who left. What they feel. What they avoid feeling. And what eventually catches up to them once the relief wears off. If you're trying to make sense of this from either side, that video will show you what comes next. Don't skip it. If this breakdown gave you clarity you didn't have before, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is the kind of analysis you won't find anywhere else. And there's more coming.